Welcome, everybody, to Do the Work with the Educator's Room. We are here tonight. We have some wonderful guests who are going to come and talk to us about Project 2025, a second Trump presidency. I'm your host, Francesca Warren, CEO of the Educator's Room. And we are going to start. We have two wonderful guests. We have Dr. TJ. Why did I call you TJ? Dr. PJ.
Starting off strong. You're starting off strong. We're
Oh,
good.
and then we have Dr. TT Lio. And so we're going to start. Who wants to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background in education, and we'll get started.
Ladies first, go for it.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, thank you for having me, Francesca. Great to be here in conversation with you, PJ. So I'm Titi Lyle Tanubu Ali, based in Atlanta, Georgia. I have worked in education policy at the intersection of communications, law, policy, and philanthropy for about 20 years now. I've worked as a consultant to nonprofits and working with state policymakers and federal policymakers to help them think about advancing policies that make sense for kids. I'm also the author of two books, one on scaling early childhood programs throughout the country, and the other on disrupting disruption, the steady transformation of schools. So excited to talk with y'all today about what we think about the incoming administration and what implications there might be for our everyday work. I'll pass it to PJ.
I was going to say, Francesca, you're
Dr. PJ, I tried to go off mute quick, and it wasn't working.
my name is Dr. PJ Cabrera. My legal name is Dr. Pedro Cabrera. Everyone calls me PJ, called me since birth. I am a college professor here in San Antonio, Texas. This is my 14th year in education. I taught middle school for 2 years. I taught high school for almost a decade. This is now my 7th year collectively in higher education. My specialty is journalism education, especially going into the new administration. I think this is an interesting topic, especially not only how it only is going to affect education, but how it's going to affect the media and how our media landscape is going to change, and especially when it comes to media literacy for our students. That's kind of where my focus is. And I think that, again, these conversations are super important because we're all educators, so we're all experts in education. So I'm incredibly excited to talk to you guys about all things education, but more importantly, all things going into this new unknown 4 years that we're about to have.
And we are joined by Dr. Zachary Kirk, the Zactivist. Introduce yourself, Zach.
Everybody, how are you guys doing? I see some wonderful friends in the chat. How you doing, Dr. Weiss? It's great to see you. I am Zachary Kirk. I am currently working for one of our nation's largest and best ed tech publishers after 17 years in education. My last job being a director of curriculum and instruction for Atlanta Public Schools. I am here, though, not necessarily as an educator or in the field of education, but as an educator who's also a content creator. And I had the extreme privilege of being able to do in-depth research and a really close deep dive on all things related to Project 2025 and what the president-elect and the incoming administration would be doing if elected, as they were. So I'm really excited to be able to kind of share some of that with you guys as someone who's read this multiple times, shared pieces of it with the whole world. And the person who is what a crazy point of fact is I'm the content creator with the largest piece of the most viewed piece of short form content on the topic regarding Project 2025. So I made a video back in early June. And when Taraji P. Henson got on the BET Awards and said Google Project 2025, it was the one that everybody consumed. It popped up first. It was quick and easy to digest, and everyone kind of saw it. I think currently I'm at like 6.2 million views now on TikTok with that one. So it's just really great to be here and to, again, answer your questions and hopefully walk away with everyone feeling a little bit more hopeful about the future.
Thank you for that. It's interesting because during the election cycle, well, let me start. I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Francesca Warren, CEO of the Educator's Room. I've been in the education field for 24 plus years, worked as a high school teacher, district admin. I've done all kinds of things. And tonight we wanted to bring this conversation with you so that we could hear as educators what this second Trump presidency is going to look like. Here at the Educators Room, we covered his first presidency extensively, good, bad, and indifferent. And one of the things in the writers' room that we kept talking about is, what is this going to look like? What are the policies? He's promised certain things. There were writers who said, Project 2025 isn't real. And then as things have transfolded, they're like, oh, yeah, this is going to be a problem. So before we go into everything, let's start with what we know about Project 2025 and what is like the 1 to 2 things that you're like, if this happens, like there's some flashing light. So what is that? And we'll start with Zach. Let's not start with you, Zach. Zach, we're going to start with Dr. Titilayo. I want you to tell us 1 or 2 things, and then we'll go to Zach, and then we'll go to Dr. PJ.
Yeah, so I'm going to put on my lawyer hat for a little bit because I think it's important for us to, when we're talking about any policy ideas, right? There's what people say, and then there's what they can actually do within the current context we have in terms of the law, in terms of the Constitution. So there's been a lot said, right? But you have to watch what can actually be done. And I know that our memories can be a little short. We can think back to the first administration and see what was attempted before and whether or not they were successful. So in terms of actual policies, I think the one that is getting folks maybe the most worked up is the demolishment of the Department of Education. Now, again, stepping back for a second, in our political environment, we have think tanks, they create ideas, we have candidates, they develop agendas, that's how it works. Doesn't mean all those things are going to happen. Doesn't mean all those things can happen, right? This incoming administration cannot, with the swipe of a brush, remove the Department of Education, okay? I want everybody to understand that and appreciate that. There has to be congressional action on that. And we have a lot going to believe that Congress would not do that, right? Now, what might happen? You might see some things shift from Department of Ed to other departments, right? You might see student loans, for example, go to Department of Treasury. Even if that does happen, again, not with a wand, we still have a democracy, right? There are things that still need to happen through Congress and through the passage of legislation in order for that to happen. And politically, there are many people, myself included, who think that would be a very tough battle because there are a lot of red states that would bear the brunt of that because of the amount of federal funding they get to their state. So somebody was talking to me the other day. They're like, y'all told us to be afraid of, not y'all personally, but people told us to be afraid of Project 2025. Now everybody's saying, well, they can't really do anything. This feels like whiplash. What is it? And that's a fair take, right? But it is true that, yes, ideas are one thing. Implementation is another thing. Both things can be true. You can both take the ideas that people put in front of you as serious and believe that they will use whatever tools that they can to move them forward. And it's important as us to be empowered citizens to understand policy and to understand what actually is practical and what actually is possible. So I think that's the biggest policy idea that's been floated and has been causing the most trouble. And I think for political reasons, which we can talk about later, and reasonable people can disagree on this, that's not something that's keeping me up at night. I don't see it happening in this term. I don't see, there are other things that I might see happening, and we can talk about what some of those are, but I think it's very important to understand just the constraints of the presidency and the constraints of the executive branch specifically when it comes to making some of these sweeping changes and how do things actually happen.
So going on to that conversation, I think the one thing that comes to mind, 100% agree with everything that you just said. Earlier today, there was a spat on The View between Whoopi Goldberg and Ana Navarro. And what Whoopi was basically saying is, we don't know what we don't know. So everybody chill out. And that's what I was trying, that's where I hear you coming from, is that we don't know what is going to happen yet. We can't react on what we think is going to happen. Where I think it's a little scary is they're telling us what they want to do. They have a blueprint of this is what we want to do, and that blueprint is very scary. But it's really it behooves us to not react to something that hasn't happened yet. And also, what you were saying is all the talk has been about the demise of the Department of Education. They want to shut it down. Yeah, that talk has been that talk has happened before, has happened a couple years, has been talked that what's the point of it, and it's just getting louder and louder and louder. But collectively, it is not a popular opinion to get rid of the department because of what you said, is that many schools in rural areas, in red areas, are going to get hit really hard if that happens. So I would hope that representatives in those areas say, this is not good for my people. This is not good. And if you guys do this, then X, Y, and Z is going to happen. The scary part is they're telling us what they're going to do, and we need to be paying attention to it. But we can't freak out if it hasn't happened yet. So, yeah.
I have some notes here because I'll even like to cite some sources, and I agree, right? But now I will say that on today's argument on The View, I align with Anna because I'm like, I do agree with you. Like, let's chill out, let's calm down, take care of your mental health. But on the other hand, be planning and proactive in how you're going to approach this. Our congressional leaders are the ones who will be responsible for the abolishment of the Department of Education. It's going to require 60 votes in the Senate, which Republicans currently do not have. But they have more today than they had, they're going to have more in January than they have in December because they've gained seats. And this will be a continuous push to gain seats as we move forward. There has been talk of abolishing the Department of Education, which is one of the smallest departments in Washington and one of the newest departments in Washington since Reagan. It's been an ongoing chug-along push. Getting these resources away from the federal level and being controlled there, pushing it out to the states, would allow states to do what some of our states are currently doing, taking money that would be going to public schools and sending them to private schools. We know in the state of Georgia, there is currently something happening where we have a list of 25% of schools, which is a huge body of schools with a very high cutoff score that would be qualifying for more support. But now the parents of kids in those schools are going to be getting voucher money on like a card to go to private schools and charter schools and other types of schools, hurting our public schools. That's kind of where the push goes and kind of what I think is going to be happening nationwide regarding what they would see as an abolishment. And so even though, it's going to take congressional approval, which they're not going to have, there are things that President Trump or President-elect Trump will be able to do through executive order that will water down what the supports and the systems that are in place. But there are some things that are in federal law that are mandated, like how we serve our students with special needs, that we're not going to be able to get rid of. We have to watch those things. We have to watch the things that matter, and we have to constantly raise the alarm and point this out to our leaders to emphasize its importance to us. If it is important to us, if it's not important to us and the American people don't care about it, then let it go. Let it go. But if it does matter to us, we need to make sure that people know that we care about this. We want this funding to remain, and we think this is something that's a priority. And really, as individuals, as educators, as people out there, we need to prioritize the most important things or the main things to us and make sure that we're ready to fight and lobby for those things. Let me give you an example of why I'm saying that. There are whole bodies of people who were in the space with me as a content creator. I was, a specific DNC content creator fighting a specific kind of fight. Now I'm seeing those people running all around talking about cabinet secretaries and nominations. Listen to me, people in the, educators room. I don't care about one single person being appointed anywhere. As long as they are not working for a foreign government on the low, I don't care. It doesn't matter to me if Pete Hedgepest has been an alcoholic and he's done all these horrible things, because a whole lot of horrible people get ready to get put in a whole lot of positions that have done a whole lot of horrible things. That's not something I would waste my time even talking about. Whereas dismantling DEI programs and ensuring that DEI programs get taken away in this country is something I would be fighting against, because that's sending a much bigger and much broader message. When the most qualified person on the Supreme Court on paper, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, is being classified as DEI, and the least qualified person on the Supreme Court by paper, Amy Coney Barrett, is not, then I know we have a problem. Then I know that there's a specific group of people, a specific marginalized group of people that look like me that's under attack. We have to prioritize our work, prioritize our efforts, and focus on the things that matter. And saving the Department of Education right now is not the biggest issue that we're faced with. Ensuring that every single student, regardless of who they are, where they come from, receives the adequate education, the best possible education possible, that is what's important.
Oh, y'all said a lot. Okay, so and I love this conversation around, hey, it's gonna be important, but here's the facts that we need to know. Because sometimes I feel like we're in this echo chamber of lots of people. It doesn't, and usually we're talking about kids, but this isn't kids and necessarily who don't understand civics, who don't understand how the American government works. And that makes me very scared, because then you start to get propaganda with things you're like, that can't happen, and people are believing it. So with, that resolve that you guys have, and like, hey, our Senate is going to have to, they're going to have to enact certain laws. This is going to be the conditions on this would happen, but there are some other things. How are you guys operating in this sense of where you're really dealing with misinformation and disinformation, and we're not talking about kids? At least I'm not talking about kids. I'm talking about adults who don't understand how things are passed, presidential privilege. How are you engaging in that as educated people who have a background in education? What are you doing? Because Zach, I saw you at a music festival where you were talking to people about, the upcoming election, and there were a lot of people who were just full of like things that weren't true. So I'll start with Zach on that. Like, what
You only heard I not only shared a part of it because the interviews were too disappointing to share, right? And I was just blinded by hope and optimism. Those interviews should have been a telltale sign. I thought that I was just randomly stumbling upon Black people that were just highly misinformed, and they were hunkering down. I'm talking about ready to like fight me because of what they believe to be true. And I just thought, this is just a weird group. So let's say I conducted 12 interviews. I would say of the 12 interviews, about 4 of them were woefully misinformed and miseducated about the issues. And so that for me renewed a focus of moving forward to focus on addressing misinformation and disinformation. That's literally something I'm focused on as a content creator moving forward. I didn't realize it was this big of a deal, nor did we catch it until it was too late, to be all honest and transparent about it. I worked with a young lady named Issa Osa. And if you know Issa Osa, you may not know Issa Osa, but Issa, write the name down. Issa Osa. Her name is really Issa Osa Issa. Write the name down, Google this woman. She is over a group called Onyx Impact. And it is a group of people that she's assembled focused on combating misinformation and disinformation. That's what I was specifically doing at One Music Fest, working for Issa Osa, doing these interviews to combat misinformation. With Issa Osa, I also ended up being on a panel with Killer Mike and the founder of the Gathering Spot, and with former Mayor Kasim Reed, who was amazing. Love that man. Had never met him in person. Did not think that his personality, which is just like it's always been, would be so refreshing in this time, because he's a true teller. And I also was on a podcast called the 85 South Show, that if you know, it's very popular in Atlanta. And all of those elements, a lot of misinformation was shared in terms of like, this is what we hear. And then knowing the facts allowed me to combat it. But it really was, now that I look back on it, a real telltale sign. And there was nothing that we could do in October that would have made a difference, because misinformation had spread too far and had spread too wide. Now we have to be on top of it, make sure that the information is captured early and that we get ahead of it. But let me give you an example of the kind of misinformation and why it spread. Because I'm gonna be honest with you, Fran, Zachary, unfortunately, is blaming the mainstream media. And when I say mainstream media, I'm talking about cable news. Right? Like, I hate to do that, but I can't find no other source. Here's the example. At a time when the mainstream news should have been talking to the American people about what tariffs were and how tariffs were going to impact their daily lives, and when they should have been talking about mass deportations and how mass deportations will impact the American economy, and how they should have been talking about saving the Department of Education and what it does. Because a lot of people even know that Title I comes under the Department of Education. Student loans and grants comes under the Department of Education. Servicing students through IDA comes under the Department of Education, as does civil rights law comes under the Department of Education. People don't know that. Why wasn't MSNBC and CNN and all the news networks talking about that when they were talking about is Kamala Harris black? Because that's what they were talking about. Is she black? Is Kamala Harris black? They wasted all of this time talking about things that did not make any difference whatsoever, throwing out red herrings and things that people ran behind and talked about instead of the real substantive issues in regards to what would happen to the American people. And now that they've gotten someone in office that gives them ratings, that encourages rage watching and rage viewing and rage clicking, they're back on the real issues. That to me is a problem. That to me was a key driver of the misinformation. Many people don't care about what they're necessarily hearing, if it's right or wrong. They're just hearing it and then they're running with it and they're repeating it. Because again, Janet Jackson, a multi-millionaire woman in this world, believes in her whole black heart that Kamala Harris is Indian and not black at all. She believes that. She believes it. She believes it so much that she fired her assistant, her social media manager, who corrected it for her online, because she said he was wrong to correct her. That's what we're up against, and that's where we dropped the ball.
So I think backstory, my doctoral degree was on journalism education, and it focused on media literacy, student voice, all that good stuff. Where I think that we have fallen as a society is not just on civic education, but also on media literacy education, because said Johnny is going to see something that's not factual, share it on his social media because he thinks passionately about it, but just shared something not factual to then his 15 friends. That one friend then shares it on their platform to their 150 friends. And now in a matter of 30 seconds, something that wasn't factually correct has been shared with a large amount of people. Now take that mentality and now turn it into our media landscape. There was a stat that I saw that throughout the election, Fox News was actually one of the highest rated news networks of the big three, of CNN, MSNBC, and you have Fox News. That Fox News was the biggest one. And as a communication professor, if I'm going to tell somebody, hey, I need you to look something up and validate your sources, I would push them to not go to Fox News because they have a proven track record of lying. So if we have to think about where the problem is, it's not only civic education, it's also on media literacy education. And as far as I know, only one state so far has mandated media literacy to our students, and that is California. So if we're getting all of this tsunami of information to our students and they do not have the tools on how to share it correctly, then that's problem number one of the many problems that we're going to we're going to have to deal with. So as educators, how can we fix that? We have to fix our little corner of the universe and our little corner of the world. So at the school that I'm at, we are developing a brand new degree in journalism, but I have been very, very, very adamant about media literacy. The media literacy should be required in that degree plan, because if people want to go out and become journalists, then they need to know how to have the literacy to disseminate the correct information to their audience, and then vice versa. If I'm having a student in my class, I want to make sure that I train them that what they're consuming is right and how to fact check themselves. The problem, among all the problems that we've talked about, is the spread of misinformation and how fast it happens to adults who don't know how to fact check themselves. And these adults who were born with cell phones. Now millennials who are now having kids are giving their kids cell phones at 2 and 3 and 4, and they're not consuming this information and then setting and sharing them and doing this and doing that. It's just a tsunami of just bad behavior that we're doing. That we're doing. It's my, I think to answer the initial question is we need a change in our little corner of the world. And I think one of our biggest things should be focusing on media literacy in all of our schools. Whether that start, I think that's a bigger fish to fry.
Mm-hmm. I agree with everything. And I think that misinformation is a big part of the story. I think disconnection is another part of the story. Because the way our lives are set up right now, it's very easy to be in your bubble. And I know we've mentioned Fox News and right-leaning media, but the same can be said for left-leaning media, right?
Absolutely.
There were a lot of misses about like what was happening and reading the room, because I think on all sides of the spectrum, folks can be very guilty of being in their bubble and not engaging with people other than those who just already think what they think, right? And that is like, there's a time for that. And there's a time for, and this is just my personal like values, right? Like I deeply believe that like in the humanity of people, unless you prove me otherwise, right? I deeply believe that with connection and with relationship, and this might be the long game and over time, that people are movable and things can change, right? It is, to Zach's point, hard to do when it's October and the election is November, right? But I'm a child of a mom who was a politician in Atlanta. I grew up knocking doors, right? I know what it's like to start a conversation with someone who is far, far, far apart. And then over time to bring that closer, right? Now, knocking doors is what we did 30 years ago. Like it's different now, right? And so being aware of the context we're in and what will it really take to burst out of our bubbles, and in terms of both the media that we're consuming to make sure that it's like complete and factual, but also in terms of the humans we're interacting with to make sure that more people are coming in contact with fact and with research. There's a study, and I'll put the link in the chat because I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago on my Substack. The article is called Talk to Everyone. And I told a story about how on vacation, because no days off, I walked up to somebody who had on the Trump t-shirt and started a conversation. I was just like, hey, were you in Pennsylvania? The t-shirt had on things that made me suggest that maybe he was. Turns out he was from Pennsylvania. It turns out both of our families have been coming to that place for 25 years. I probably played with him in the pool at one point and didn't even know it. Our birthdays were a few weeks apart. This was July of this year, right after sort of the candidate switch and announcement. Was he movable in that moment? No. But as I was listening to him, I heard the misinformation he had and how he was justifying his choice based on the information that he had. And when we go back next summer, I'm gonna have another conversation with him. And we're just gonna keep having conversations. And maybe because there's a relationship and because there's trust, we became like little besties over the 2 weeks. Just at least saying hi, being at the bar, like engaging. Maybe there'll be an opening to talk about what some of those facts are.
I love
that foundation.
I love that you said that because that kind of coincides with what I was thinking. Like we have to change our little corner of the universe. So you have to focus on that one guy and like that one person, develop a relationship with them and be like, hey, now that we're besties, do you know what you said was not true? Do you know it? And maybe encourage him to see things a different way. And I'm actually curious to everybody because what you said was super important. We are in our echo chambers. Like we believe what we believe and we do not want to get out of that, right? And so much so that a lot of people voted against their best interest in this next election. So like specific to education, like how do we as educators, how do we explain that people voted against their own education benefits? They voted against their own kids. They voted against their own student aid. Like, how do we explain that to people? Because it's really difficult for me to say, like, your vote was wrong, because I'm not going to tell you your vote's wrong. It's difficult for me to say that, but it's easier for me to say, like, your vote meant that your student loans may not be forgiven. Your vote meant that your kid may not get the right services that he or she needs, because those are factual statements that may or may not happen. So like, how do you explain to people you voted against your own interest?
Well, I will
You
put
tell them every time
I
that we're
think
in the
it might.
FAFO.
No, go ahead, Zach. I had something to say
No, I
about
was
that.
gonna
I
say,
think
I'm sorry, Dr.
sometimes we assume that like the way that we stack issues is the way other people stack them, right? So my friend, right, at the beach, he owns a business. He was worried about like, you know, his perception, again, based on the information he had, like of him being able to keep the business open, to be able to pay for his family, to be able to keep his employees hired. Like these are like, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of issues, right?
Yeah.
And so like there might be a world in which he cares about high quality education for all kids, but not if he can't eat, right? And so like I know that like I caution sometimes against our framing of like our like the way that we value issues and putting that on others, right? Because I think like, is he wrong to have that? Like, does he have the privilege to think that far down? I mean, I think that's like for some people, that's like a values and like even like a spiritual question, right? But, and it's not that I necessarily agree with that perspective, but I try to come with some level of understanding, and then maybe we can go from there. But what I found from that conversation was like, oh, like, yes, to your point, PJ, if he only knew the real policies, he would know that many of the things that he cares about were in line with those. But there are some policies that Trump is advancing that will help him. And those are more important to him in the moment. So I think it's both about like helping people understand the policies and then making the connection to the right now, because at least for people, it feels more pressing. You know, we've heard all this about the price of eggs. They don't understand tariffs, like Zach said. Like they don't. So there's some education that needs to happen. And also, I think some recognition of starting with values and what's important to others and then hooking the conversation to that, because folks don't always just take a policy lens, right? When they're thinking about things, they think about their basic needs and what hurts them most right now.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I think three. I'm gonna give three really brief kind of things to say. Starting off with answering, you know, the question is that we're living in the FAFO. You F around, you find out. And I think that it's important that we take moments, and when the find out part comes, we bring that to the forefront and we let people know. And so I'm not here to talk, you know, because again, I'm praying every day that the find out doesn't have to happen, that it doesn't happen.
I think we're already there. We're already there.
Right. They're lining it up. Okay. They're buying facilities to make some part of the find out happen. They're making the language to get tough with certain countries to define, but again, it doesn't happen till it happens, right? So hopefully that before January 21st, some things will change, some hearts will change, some minds will change, and we won't get there. That is the hope. That is the prayer. But if we do get there and things happen that people have said would happen, we make sure that people know it's happened. I know earlier was talked about like the left-leaning. I don't think we have a left-leaning media. When 2024 is not like 2016. Here's a prime example. In 2016, the Washington Post was owned by a different owner, and they had a whole headline, "Democracy Dies in the Darkness," and they had an entire focus on ensuring that didn't happen. Jeff Bezos is there. That's totally different owners, totally different people with totally different viewpoints about what matters. And you saw that in how news was covered in 2024. The people that run now on CNN, the lowest rated news network on cable TV, are completely different, many of them being Trump donors. So it's a different day. So I don't believe that we have a left-leaning anything. And I think that had a small impact as well on the election, on what was prioritized and, you know, and how it's covered. In regards to how we, again, combat that, is that once these things happen, we talk about it and we educate our people with real accurate facts. Not with fear mongering about what, you know, this could be, but like, here are the real facts, because people don't know the facts. I think people did vote against their own interests, but the problem was they did not know what their interests were. And they also didn't know what was going to happen in regards to those interests because it wasn't talked about enough. I don't believe that enough people knew the plan and the agenda that was there, because we talked about Project 2025, but mainstream media said, or they said this isn't true, or it's not, President Trump isn't a part of it. To be fair, he doesn't work for the Heritage Foundation, so that was accurate. But the flip side are the connections that were in place between the people that have worked for him and that he planned to work for him again, as we're now seeing. That's what we have to highlight, and that's what we kind of have to really share.
What I think is sad is that we are a society that thinks me first rather than us first. And I think that this election was the epitome of that. This election was, how am I going to benefit? And as long as I benefit, and as long as I have a life, as long as I continue forward, at what cost to my neighbor? At what cost to the people down the street? And very similar to what y'all said, it's about me. And if Jack Johnson, and this is just a random person, if Mr. Jack Johnson can validate that his vote is going to lead his life forward, you can't argue against that, because he feels that way, and honestly, some policies may benefit him forward, but because he voted that way, then that means less to the neighbor. That's really difficult to get people to understand, is that your vote, however you may have voted, may have maybe taken you 2 steps back or 2 steps forward, but took the next person 15 steps back. So if it's okay for you to take 2 steps back in order for your neighbor, your friend, your partner, whatever, to take 15 steps forward, and at that point you're out on a level playing field, then great. That mentality is so difficult to get people to understand, that we are now in the find out stage of that statement, and we can't go back.
So no, go ahead. Finish.
Go ahead. I finished that statement. You're good.
So, it's interesting that each one of you guys have talked about this disinformation, misinformation, and I keep coming back to us as educators, whether we're in the classroom, whether we're in front of kids, whether we're in front of principals, whether we're doing policy. When we talk about everything that's happened, and we've talked about how there has to be certain conditions in order for, like, the Department of Ed to be gone, what are some of the things that you want to see this election? What would you like for the changes to be in our education system based on just what we've seen? I was reading an article about in Finland, how it is a national curriculum now, where they teach kids how to find and to battle misinformation and disinformation. It's part of the curriculum. Everybody gets it. And I was reading it and I was thinking to myself, this would be very powerful, because just today, somebody shared a picture of a cruise ship sinking. And I'm like, that's AI, that's not real. But people were like, oh my gosh, that's real. And I'm like, no, that's not real. So what would you guys like to see based off this election? And we know there is a disconnect based on what people know to be true, policy, all those things. What would you like to see that's different for us?
In a realistic situation, do not touch anything. Do not touch anything, because the question you asked is, what do you want to see in the next election? What I want to see in the next election, specifically to education, is don't touch it. Leave it alone. Leave the Department of Ed alone. Leave everything alone, because I think that that's a very big question, is to change national curriculum. That's not going to happen, because most education systems are at the state level. Change the state curriculum. That may not happen, because we're so divided right now. So you know what? Leave the status quo alone. Let it be, and let's just write out these 4 years specific to education. But I also don't think that education is not the hot topic. There's a lot of other things that are being yelled at from the mountaintop, and hopefully at some point the talk of education is just going to dim out, and that people just leave it alone. In an ideal situation, if let's say somebody comes around and say, we want to make changes to the national curriculum, media literacy needs to be required from California to Maine to Florida. Not only civic education, because I think government is a class that's taught, and it may not just be taught the right way, but media literacy needs to be required top down, because we're at a time in society where we are getting bombarded with information and don't know what to do with it. We are seeing the picture of the cruise ship and immediately we're thinking share. We're not thinking, oh, is this real? Oh, let me analyze this. Oh, let me go ahead and open up a new tab to see, did a cruise ship just crash somewhere? We don't think that. We immediately click share, and that's by design. How do we get that misinformation out? Or how do we share said information quickly that gave me an emotional reaction? But by doing that, it then leads to the spread of information, the spread of misinformation. If we can teach students to not do that, to fact check themselves, I think a lot of the problems that we have can be mitigated. But I don't think we're going to get there. And because I don't think we're going to get there, just leave it all alone. At least for the next 4 years, leave it all alone and don't touch it, so the department itself can fix the problems that it has. It has the biggest issue that's being happening right now with the Department of Education, among many, is the FAFSA debacle that happened in the last year. Fix that. Go ahead and fix that. Give that department the resources to ensure that that problem is fixed. But that's one of those things where I think could happen. But all the other stuff that I think is wanting to be done with the Department of Education, just leave it alone and just let it do its job.
Zach, you look like you're thinking. I have thoughts, but you look like you're gonna jump in.
Did I give y'all enough to react about?
Yeah, when Fran asked a question, I'm like, girl, what you talking about? We are dealing with an administration that is selling Trump Bibles and putting them in every classroom in Oklahoma. Okay, like what I want from this administration, unfortunately, is horrible to say, is just to let public education stand. Just let public education continue to exist.
Let it be.
It's just that simple. That's right. And so again, one thing that I did in preparation for this, call was what are the things that could be done through executive action. And the real target in the Department of Ed is the Office of Civil Rights. And literally, by reducing federal oversight through Project 2025's implementation, there could be large-scale issuing of guidance to scale back investigations into civil rights violations in schools. That's a real concern, where you have students who are being targeted because of race, nationality, or any other reason that would come under the Office of Civil Rights, but you're scaling them back. You're cutting them down to their bare bones. You've released the staff, and then you do not authorize for the investigations to take place. That is what I'm worried about. That's very likely to happen in a scaled back Department of Education. We're looking at taking away some of the Obama era protections that were put in place that enhance these opportunities for our students to get their due diligence and justice. Also, we're looking at some concerns around how things are regulated. Those are the things that if we just don't touch those things, if we just let this continue to just exist, I will be a happy man.
Yep.
On the OCR point, being a researcher, the data on discipline, for example, that's held in OCR, we saw in Trump 1 how there were pauses on the collection. It was supposed to happen, every so years. It didn't happen, and then there were delays. So that's one thing I'm worried about, because if we don't have the data, then how can we make the case for what needs to happen? How can we really see what's happening, right? So that's one thing. Francesca, to your question about, I'm gonna shift to a little bit of like possibility. So one of the things I found interesting is how Silicon Valley has just like welcomed this administration with open arms. And I think that it's not unrelated to what we've seen in terms of advances in tech and AI. And so to your question earlier, like I do think that there will be an AI something that will happen. I have concerns about like the many tools that are on the market right now. And it's kind of like a free for all. Do they all really help kids? Are some of them just a money grab? So I think I have concerns about like, what's the quality mechanism to make sure that, are we leaving districts to just grapple with which tool they should use? Or is there going to be a more robust way of making sense of what's out there and how it can really help kids? I think that AI is an opportunity to have some of these conversations around media literacy, right? One of the things that I like as I'm, coaching, more junior people with their use of AI is that AI is really good if you know what you're talking about. If you don't know what you're talking about, then you don't know how to check AI and say, like, that's not right, or ask a follow-up question, or make sure that's a verified source. And so my concern is like that people are replacing AI with developing the real depth on things. And so I think there's a need to develop more literacy around the tool itself to make sure that people are making the highest and best use of it, and it's not replacing the work of actually learning a thing, so that you can treat it like a tool and not a replacement, right? Also, we can't have media literacy if we don't have literacy. So there's just like the part of me who's just like, I still drive by the elementary school that is near my parents' house in Southeast Atlanta, and I follow the milestone data all the time because I'm a nerd. And there are still 3 out of 40 kids in the 3rd grade who are proficient in reading. So like, that's what I spend a lot of my time on. Like, how do we make sure that our students have what they need to just engage in society? Like, you can't be media literate if you aren't literate. And it's a 5-alarm fire for many of our kids in our school. So again, there's going to be a lot to be upset about potentially over the next 4 years. I wanted to make sure that folks aren't forgetting about the neighborhood schools around the corner, the districts they live in. If you can tell me all these federal policies, I hope you can tell me your school board members. I hope you can tell me policies that are recently passed. Like, be about it, right? If you're gonna like really be about it in your community, because as we've said all along, education is primarily a state and local function. And that isn't to say that the federal government doesn't play an important role. It most certainly does, particularly, and I appreciate Zach like raising all these things about civil rights, And again, politics aside, like we all pretty much agree that maybe very little is to happen about education. Both campaigns were actually pretty quiet on education. And that was because the polls said that people didn't really care about it that much. They were more interested in economics and other things. So I think that there are certainly things to think about and pay attention to at the federal level, but we can't forget about the state and local level. There may be a play on AI. I think there's a way to tie that with media literacy, but there's no media literacy if we don't have literacy. So we can't.
Agreed, 100% agreed. And I think that 100% agreed on everything that you said. And that goes back to what I said earlier about the person who's focused on themselves, meaning what's going to make them, how does their vote lead to them being better? But I'm going to say something that just, I don't know if it's factual statement, but meaning I think that a lot of people are not in tune with their local politics and don't understand that their local politics are going to affect them more day to day, including their school board, including their city council, including their local state representative, and how that impacts education and how that impacts your local street, on how that impacts everything else that you do day to day. And I hope that people understand that when you see the amount of people that come out for federal elections compared to when they come out for city elections or state elections, it's sad to me, because those city elections and those state elections are the ones that are going to impact you the most, including your local schools. So you can't sit here and say, yeah, get rid of the Department of Education when you didn't go out and vote for your state election or your city election or the bond election to better said local school down the street. So everything that you said, I just loved, and I just want to just double down on that there needs to be a focus on what's your mindset locally. Because if you don't know who your school board member is or your state representative is, do you really have something to say in this conversation, I guess you want to say?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you guys talk about that, because what we find just locally, I'm in Atlanta, you guys are all over the country, is that there is a lack of information just on the local level. And so people can't even get to that federal level because they're so discombobulated on like, who makes the laws? Who does this? Is it my municipal government? Is it my school board? What does the school board do? What is a How much is their budget? So I appreciate that. And it really, has me thinking about who is going to have the most impact. So when we talk school board members, as you're sitting here listening, tell us who represents you. What is the operating budget of your school board? And what are some of the things that your school board is concerned about? Because they all have legislative priorities. So what are those? How are we engaging in those? But I do think there is something to be said, even kids. For those who don't know, I'm on a school board. And when I go and meet kids, they're like, you're the first school board member I've ever met. Like, what do you do? And they're so interested. When I went to a 4th grade class, the 4th grade, it actually was middle school, the middle schoolers had so many questions about discipline, about how is it determined. They were really, really hungry for answers. And what I realized is that no one in my position had ever talked to them about it. And so they had questions and they want to know, like, you get paid $1 million. Like, they really didn't know. And when you talk to them, they're like, oh, wow, that's why. Oh, wow, we didn't know that. So I really appreciate that. But it's also, my mind got me thinking about just leadership, right? Because whatever is going to happen with the Department of Ed in the second Trump presidency with education, it may or may not happen, just like anything else. But I want to pivot a minute and talk about leadership, because we do know we're getting a new Secretary of Education, McMahon, who was the former co-founder of the WWE, Linda McMahon. And I want to know, what were your initial thoughts on her being the person in charge? And, is there something to be said about someone who's not in education leading the department? Could this be a good thing? Could this be I don't know.
My initial thoughts were, once it was announced, all of those memes from when she was part of her husband's organization came up. That's where my initial thoughts, and I laughed. I was like, this is what's happening? Okay, cool. Like, that's where my initial thoughts. Then, of course, all of us, I think the people who are in this academic community said, okay, let me start Googling. Let me start finding information out. Let me start, along with the memes that I laugh, let me start figuring out who she is. And when I'm gonna rant for a second. It boggles my mind sometimes that people want to be leaders in education who have never been in the classroom at its core. And I'm not saying that you can't. I'm not saying that you can't study education policy and then be influential. I'm not saying that. But at the crutch of who we are as educators, as we continue on in our profession, is having been at the front of that classroom in a room with 25, 30 kids, whatever, and trying to educate them. And she's never done that. To me, you're done. To me, that's a disqualifier. To me, that was like, you've never been a teacher, therefore, I don't think you should lead the Department of Education. And it was that simple. I know a lot of other people may think differently, but that was my initial thought, is among all the many things that I looked up, she's never been a teacher. Y'all can go next.
Yeah. Okay. So from what does ed day-to-day look like perspective, and I think Zach mentioned before of all the agencies, ed being a smaller one. And this is a little bit glass half full. And so that's how I roll. Because in the policy world, you think about like what's possible and working within the context that you have, not necessarily like best case scenario. So she was confirmed before as head of or administrator of SBA, right? Small Business Administration. So she was like, and by both parties, right? Like she wasn't just like popular with Republicans. She was confirmed by Democrats as well. People say that she was a good manager in that role, that she did a decent job. What's interesting, I think, about the pick is that if you were, and a couple of folks I've spoken to have felt similarly, that if you were thinking about dismantling the Department of Ed, you might not pick her. Like you might pick someone who's like, was just there to do that. She held a real job before in the administration. She has done some work at a policy think tank before. So she has some policy chops. Being part of SBA, there's some speculation that there might be some movement on things like childcare, which is tied very closely with like women's participation in the workforce and anyone's participation in the workforce, to be honest. But that was something that she held up before. So it strikes me as a bit of it's not a worrisome choice to me, in the sense that I think that there will be like major shifts in terms of what happens next. There might be, maintenance of the status quo to a certain extent at the federal level, but it's not like frightening in terms of the Department of Ed largely moves money through, and you need somebody who understands how to move money through. You do need somebody, and not educators always don't know how to do that. There are a lot of people with different skill sets, right, who might not know how to do that. So I tend to think about it as like, what's the function of the role, and how, like, what would it take to do that well? Compared to other agencies, it's smaller than others. And so I think like having a good manager, having someone who understands how to move money, to the extent that it's still going to be a functioning department that does that role, is important. But she's not a person that has like incoming strong ideological perspectives on issues, which I found interesting, right? I do think that might mean that she might be more susceptible to whatever the administration decides to do, which, I mean, still yet to come. Like what that is, there probably will be some kind of federal move on vouchers that looks more like a tax credit. There was a mention about vouchers earlier. I have a lot to say on that. I think if it's a tax credit, that's one thing. But as we've seen these voucher policies play out in the states, again, thinking about like what they say, what they do, and what difference it actually makes. In Georgia, $6,500 is not getting you too far into a private school if you do get the voucher, right? Like, what does it really do in terms of like, is the money going from public schools to private schools? Because is the take up actually going to be what we think it's going to be? Too soon to tell. We just passed a law here. But I think when you look at other states, you can see that, again, like it's definitely a policy proposal that Republicans push forward. Then the question is like, how does it even matter? And can it actually be fully utilized for that purpose? Because we know here in Metro Atlanta, for example, private schools cost 10 times what that voucher is actually giving you. And so it's not actually, it'll be subsidizing families that could already potentially pay for it. But I think even that's a question, because there are some income limits to it. And so it won't be that like you can be a wealthy family that would have paid for the whole tuition anyway. Now you get an extra $6,500. There's just a lot of questions, right? So again, policies move forward. Are they actually going to be implemented well? Do they really matter in terms of the everyday lives of students and families? And will they really have the intended result when you think about the market, when you think about people's actual choices?
When she was over small business, she wasn't you didn't hear a lot from her. You didn't hear a lot about her. So if she keeps that same way of doing things, then going back to what I initially said earlier, if you keep the status quo the same, if you're good, if you let it be, if you let it do its job, and if she's not going to be loud about it, then you know what? Okay. You know what? I hear you. Do your thing. Ugh, but I'm a little wary. But again, if those two things, if she wasn't loud before, she's not going to be loud again. And if you just let the department do what it does, okay.
Yeah, she's one of the 11 billionaires who've been appointed to cabinet positions, which is, a striking moment in American history. She's more qualified than Betsy DeVos in terms of having had experience leading an organization at the federal level. Her work with the Small Business Administration, again, makes her, she was more qualified than the last one that was appointed previously. I am too disappointed that she doesn't have an education background. Don't know to what extent her kids ever even attended public schools or even her, but she is better than Betsy on paper. We will see what she will be, but I expected nothing more than what we've gotten thus far in the cabinet picks. I'm just hoping that as we move forward, these people become vested in the departments that they're being tasked to lead. They learn about the departments, historical significance of the departments, and the important work that's being put under the departments. That is my hope.
So one of the things that, as we're getting questions from YouTube and I'm looking at Instagram, one of the questions that people want to know is, how do you, one teacher, I'm going to read exactly what she said, and then you guys respond as necessary. They said, it's really taken them this long to really come to the fact that we're going to have a second Trump presidency. I am a Republican by nature. However, I did not vote for him this time. They really want to know, they think that let me read exactly. I don't think that the changes will come as swift as everybody thinks they will. However, I am really concerned about the vouchers and the dismantling of public education, and that people don't think they need public schools anymore. What can you talk about from a policy perspective and from a perspective of just morale for teachers? How do we combat that this second time? The first time felt exhausting.
I think going back to what was said earlier, the vast majority of people need to understand that our community schools are largely regulated at the local and state level. So all of the talk that's happening at the federal level about the Department of Ed, just understand that the vast majority of our schools are locally ran. Therefore, if you are concerned with your public school, get involved in your public local school district. Know who the school board is. Know who your local reps are. Know who your state reps are, because the vast majority of our schools are locally run. That's my answer to that question.
Love that.
Yeah. And the share of students in public schools has consistently been 90%, if not a little bit more than that. Overwhelmingly, students are educated in our public schools. So that's not changing anytime in our lifetimes, likely. And so, as PJ said, and as we said earlier, right, these are state and local issues. I think globally, and we touched on this a little earlier, right? And I think that this is the case really when you're engaging with the media and when you're engaging with policy generally. Think about your cares as limited, right? And there will be a time for outrage on something that's a real threat. And also think about your nervous system, right? We are designed to react when we're under threat, right? And we either fight, we flee, we fawn, we do lots of different things when there are real challenges. If we are constantly running ourselves up with everything someone says that's actually not a policy yet, not a reality yet, and there's a balance, as Zach said, you need to be proactive and you need to be defensive. You're not always just going to wait until things happen, because then you'll be too late sometimes. But it's thinking about, where are the real threats? I am in my house. I am safe right now. I am on this block. I am in this street. I am in this community. I am in this community of faith, if that's what you do, whatever it is, think about where you and your community is, to PJ's point, right? A lot of us, many of us, I don't want to speak for us, but some of us come from a cultural perspective where it isn't just all about you. It's about you and the community and your ancestors and the people who are coming in front of you. You're thinking about all of that at the same time. And so I think reserve your energy for those things that will require you to actually fight, right? When that happens. But we can't just run ourselves up every time there's an idea, because those aren't real threats. And there's a lot of good that's happening right around you, probably, or a lot of possibility. And there are places to lean into those who are doing the work, making things better, and, making education a stable and fruitful thing for the children in your community.
Dr. Kirk? What advice would you give this teacher?
I want to have more hopeful words, but I was there is no other advice that I can give other than take it day by day. Take it day by day, go into it, and you focus on what you can impact and what you have a say in doing, and you do that well. And that's the only thing that I can think of to help us push through any kind of tough time. For things that I'm unable to control, is for me hands off. I don't care about these cabinet nominations. I don't care about that because I can't control that. I can't pick no cabinet. But what I can do is I can lobby in advance to, again, maintain some of the structures of public education that I know will benefit children. So yeah, that's my focus. My recommendation is only focus on what you can control and do that well.
And I think that goes back to just to kind of extend the answer to her question. Like, go to your local school. Like, just go and see what is happening in those classrooms. I mean, with security in mind and all those things in mind, like, go and look at like the school, because when I was a teacher, when I was at the high school level, like, getting a sub was difficult because nobody wanted to come into our school. So become a sub and actually go into those hallways and see, okay, this is what a teacher has to deal with from 8 to 4 or 8 to 5 or whatever. If you want to actively participate, become a sub, be part of the PTO, go to the school board meetings, because vast majority of people don't even know what happens in those meetings. Like, get actively involved with your local school district if you want to know how your school district works and how your schools work. Because just like everybody said, there's a lot of talk and we have to wait, but the vast majority of the talk on that federal level may or may not directly affect the local school down the street. You just have to know if it's going to or not. So especially for our rural schools, and our rural schools are going to be hit if some sort of change happens, especially at the federal level. Our rural schools are going to get hit a lot more than our urban schools are. So I understand that people in our rural schools or rural areas may be a little bit more affected, but do they even know that? Do they even know that? So just get actively involved in your local school districts. I think it's going to be the most important thing, and there are ways to do that.
I think a theme tonight has been around get active, know local, manage your nervous system. Like, everything is not at 100 right now. It could be. We could be 6 months from now on fire, but right now, be measured. I'm gonna give you guys another question that we have on YouTube. On YouTube, this parent, I don't know if it's a parent, this person says, thank you guys for this. I've been really, really curious about what this is going to look like. They put in parentheses, a second Trump presidency. This is going to look like? I would love to know your thoughts on special education. I am a teacher and I have a special needs child. And I'm not so much worried that the Department of Education will go away. However, I am worried about some of the protections that are there that I believe will currently go away, specifically around FERP, and also around guidance to schools, students with disabilities not being put out due to behavior. So I don't know what all that means. I do know what it means, but I don't know where they're coming from that. So let's switch, because we have about 17 minutes. Let's talk about social education and what it may or may not look like in this next administration.
Well, I'm not a special education specialty or teacher or whatever. It goes back to what I said earlier. I think if let's say everything's not on fire yet, like y'all mentioned, but let's say a lighter or a fuse has been lit and the target is special education funding. Where I think that is where the outrage will happen is those special education parents. Because when they realize that said student is not going to get said support because that federal funding is not there, then the parent's going to get mad. And at that point, that's when the special education office and the special education teacher and the leaders of school has to say, all right, here's my time to educate. Mom, the reason that we can't do this service anymore is because we have lost federal funding to do so. That's the part where we mentioned earlier, what changes can we make? And that officer or that administrator, whatever, that's where they can make that change to begin to educate said parent that who may or may not have voted for Trump, that because of their vote, that said kid did not get said services. And that's where that change has to happen. The outrage is going to have to happen when, unfortunately, those decisions are made that's going to affect that kid, that's going to get that parent to then begin to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a valid concern, right? Sometimes people raise IDEA funding, so which is the federal funding for special education, as a concern. And again, like caveated with all the things we talked about, like us not believing this would happen. To PJ's point, you don't want to mess with the special education lobby. You do not. And politicians know that. They don't want, they are organized, they are well funded, and they will be at your doorstep and in your office. So I don't think it's going to happen for political reasons. Practically speaking, though, when you look at, and this might be helpful to just explain for some people who don't understand how education funding works, right? So we've been talking about how the federal government plays a small role in the administrative, aspects of education, but also in the funding aspects. It's varied a little bit. It went up during the pandemic, of course, with all of that funding. But even that's ending around the same time that this administration is coming in. So that'll be an interesting shift to happen where states will see like that federal amount reducing because the ESSER funds had to be spent. But the federal chunk, so just looking at special education in Georgia, there's about, I'm just going to estimate about 12,000 per pupil of special education funding that happens, right? Of that, a tiny slice of that is federal. A bigger chunk of that is state funding. And then another chunk of that, which is less than state, but is still significant, is local funding. So you always have federal funding, state funding, and local funding when you're thinking about per pupil funding amount. So even if, which I don't think anyone's proposing that the money goes away. And again, no one can do that. That is an act of Congress. And even if that does happen, the money would have to shift in another way. Things just can't go poof. Right? So maybe that federal money would go to states in a different way, but it wouldn't necessarily disappear. But even if it did, right, there's still funding for special education happening. So anyone telling you that if the Department of Ed is abolished, again, which we don't think it will be, then special ed kids won't get funded, that is not factually correct. There is still local funding. There is still state funding. That is the majority of funding for all students. But even when you just look at special ed funding, federal funding is a small slice on the top of that. Schools would not appreciate the cuts. Again, we don't think they're going to happen, but there still would be funding flowing to special education. And it would be a matter, as it always is, of figuring out like how to do more with less. Of course, there are all other kinds of issues connected to this special education issue. Do we have enough teachers who have the credentials to educate special education students? How are we assessing students? Are we over assessing some students? Are we over identifying some students in certain ways? There's a lot of practice questions in here that I think are part of a broader special education conversation that is ongoing. But in terms of, again, like immediate threats, we don't think it's going to happen. But when you understand how funding happens anyway, the large share of special education funding is state and local.
Yep, I 100% agree. And so let's say pretend worst comes to worst, right? Let's just pretend that we find 8 Democratic senators who are going to agree with Republicans and they're going to abolish the Department of Education. Even if that were to happen, IDEA would still exist as federal law. It's not going to go away. So they're not going to get rid of it. This will continue, and it would just go back in theory to another department, perhaps the Department of Health and Homeland. Was it under Department of Health before? Wherever it was before we had Department of Education, it would constantly go right back to that. And I think that's kind of like written out in the plan itself. It's how it will be shuffled and reshifted. So the funding will still be there, the support will be there, but how it is given oversight very well possibly could be reduced. That's just one possibility. With reduced oversight and reduced accountability, it would be possible also that some of the protections put in place by the civil rights, by the Department of Civil Rights and from the DOJ specifically targeting and supporting our students with disability, that would be perhaps minimized or not monitored in the same way. That would lead to what would feel like possibly less services. But if you're in a strong school system and you have strong current special ed support right now, that should continue without any change whatsoever. And that's kind of a good thing. And it's kind of like, that's not the special ed isn't, and IDA isn't what I'm most concerned about in this moment. I think that it's going to endure and be fine and be well supported throughout the next 4 years. But the point is, in order to ensure that, is to mobilize right now. is to make sure that you have your Google alerts on. And so when something happens with special ed, IDA, special ed law in your state, and even at the national level, you see those alerts and you're sharing it out with a group of parents. It's time to have parent groups mobilize for the right things. Instead of mobilizing to ban books, let's mobilize to protect our kids who are with special identified needs, those who are gifted and those who are striving to be gifted in a different way. Like, that's what we want to work on, and that's what we need our parents to mobilize on, because you guys have the power to ensure that your babies are supported in the way they should be supported.
And it's interesting you just said that, because, this summer in Georgia, AP African American History, the idea was not to fund it, right? And from the state level, and parents, ours included, me included, were like, absolutely not, right? So it's important that you talked about that channeling the right energy. We haven't talked about book bans. We have 9 minutes. So very briefly, we have seen this happen in states. States have done this. Do you guys think that we will see more of some of the things that we've seen? Of course, we've seen the vouchers movement. We've seen the banning of books. We've seen the taking out of African American history, or, sensitive topics or controversial topics. Do you think that this is something that the Trump administration will latch on to through executive order or through whatever means to make that a national thing in states that wasn't?
I'm afraid of the reinstatement of the 1776 Commission to influence how history is teaching. It was something that came in under the Trump administration towards the end, and then kind of got booted right out when Biden came in. I'm afraid that may come back, and that may be reinstated and then finally implemented fully. They didn't have a chance to implement it fully back in 2020. The time ran out, but I'm afraid that something like that may come back. And if that happens, you would have greater censorship across the board as connected to federal funding, because what they'll say is, we can't mandate this into law, but we can choose to not fund X, Y, and Z as priorities based on you doing or not doing these things. So that's my biggest fear in regards to like the book banning elements and those things, is the reinstatement of the 1776 Commission.
And so we are at a time in society where we have access to an obnoxious amount of information. So do I think that book bans are going to be back into the conversation? Absolutely. I think state and federal leaders are going to try their best to just attack public education. But the fortunate part is, if, let's say, leader Jack Johnson, great person. If leader Jack Johnson come out and says, we're going to ban said book, that book is easily accessible online. So that knowledge is not going to go anywhere. The access to that knowledge is not going to go anywhere. It sucks at the fact that that there is even an effort to ban books, and that's just suppressing information and the exchange of information. But where there is a will, there is a way. And if said parent really wants their child to read that book, they will find a way to do it. It's just not going to be through their public schools. It is the unfortunate part that leaders are going through their public schools to further their agenda. And unfortunately, the people that are going to hurt are our students and our children. So they may not be able to read that book in ABC Elementary down the street, but I doubt that the library down the street is going to ban it. And I doubt that Amazon's not going to ban it. And I doubt that there are going to be ways to get said book. Is it going to happen? I would bet money that talk is going to happen again. And the suppression of information
Yeah, I do think that, I think what they're calling it is wokeism or anti-wokeism. I do think that's going to be a big thing, partly because it rallies the base. And I think, like, despite the fact that the federal government has no real authority to ban any books, like, I think it's still going to be that is, again, state, local, right? But I do think that will be part of the conversation. And I think there again, like, continue to look at what your state is doing. Francesca mentioned that happened here in Georgia. Important to, and to this point of education, like, helping people understand, well, what does the actual law in place say? And how does that align with what leaders pushing this are saying about it, right? And empowering parents with an understanding of the law and policy to say, like, wait a minute, like what you're actually saying you want to do is not aligned with what the actual statute says. And so, no, that's not going to happen, right? So again, like education on so many levels, right? Educating folks on what in often cases, poorly worded laws around this actually say and mean, and what could happen and what can't happen, I think is important. I do think that this will be, I don't think it's going away. And it's a state and it's a local issue. And so get involved and call your people, know their numbers, know their email addresses.
Go to your local school.
Share how you feel.
Go to your local school. Go to your
public library.
Your public libraries. All these public institutions that we're complaining about on the federal level. Go to them. Go to your schools. Go to your libraries and get involved locally, because your impact is more felt at the local and state level.
Yeah. It's interesting. We have about 4 minutes left, and we always like to play this game, is around the idea of tomorrow is December 10th, and you have just been named the Department of Education. You have 4 years to improve education. I want you to pick the 2 things that you would focus on that first year.
Federal loan forgiveness, especially for public servants. So if you are serving our public for the better, whether it's teachers, firefighters, nurses, whatever, loan forgiveness there, and then media literacy across the board. Again, most of our curriculum is based on the state and local level. That's just me being idealistic. But I see a problem, and it's a lack of media literacy skills, and I would try to tackle that. And then loan forgiveness, like loan debt. We can't tell students and people, go to school, and then burden them with decades of debt. So try to find a way to clear that especially for people who are public servants. That would be my 2.
Yeah, I agree 100%. You definitely want to ensure student loan forgiveness for public service across the board and make sure that happens. That's a great priority, as well as ensuring that a framework or a standard of service is delivered across the country for all students. That is one thing I want to see. We tried with standards. It didn't work, and that's understandable, right? Because we get all the reasons why Common Core could not endure. But if we can't have Common Core, we can at least have common standards of service that every child gets. These are the bare basic framework things that every single child in this country is given as a right to free and fair and adequate access to public education.
Mm-hmm. 2 things come to mind. One is wonky, nerdy, but important. And the other one might feel more like tangible. I would create an incentive for states to, again, on this funding issue, make their funding formulas. Well, 1, update them. Many states have funding formulas that are 70 years old, 45 years old.
Texas.
Old.
Texas.
Okay. And don't actually account for the cost of educating at a high quality level in 2024, almost 2025. So I would create a way, and this might include some kind of program to help get states going in that direction, for them to reevaluate their funding formulas and to structure in a way that is more equitable, because if we don't have money, we don't have anything. Some states' funding formulas are actually regressive. So the students in the places that need more money get less money. It's a mess, right? So that's one wonky thing that I think would have a cascading effect on everything. The second thing would be universal pre-K. We didn't talk about Head Start. That also was something that has been floated, ending Head Start. Head Start, by the way, is not in Department of Education. It's in Health and Human Services and the Administration of Children and Families. It's a federal pre-K program. It has bipartisan support. Another reason why that will never happen, which is why I didn't bring it up, because I'm also not worried about that either. But I would. We got so close with Build Back Better, almost getting to universal pre-K, but that ran into some political issues. I think if they had not called it pre-K, everybody would have been fine. but politics is what it is. But I would figure out a way to frame it so that I would have the bipartisan support we need. We know from the research that getting kids off to a strong, healthy start is what makes the difference moving forward. A lot of the gaps that we see later on, when you look back, they started earlier. That's not to say we can't make changes later, but it costs more, it takes more time. And these are kids' lives. So I would start earlier, invest in high quality pre-K and childcare. It's both an education play to make sure students are set up for success, and it's an economic play so that families, caregivers can participate in the workforce, knowing that the little people that they love are being nurtured and cared for in a high quality setting. That's what I would do tomorrow.
You guys are going to make excellent Department of Ed secretaries. Like,
don't want the job.
They're so like, they're all in different spaces. Dr. Zach, did you tell yours?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I thought. Okay. I had a mind blow.
It was a standard of service and student loan forgiveness, but
yes.
definitely a standard of service that every child in this country is guaranteed this level of service from public education.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you guys, and so, as we listen to this and as we go into, holidays, and the inauguration will be in January, and we will see, things come to surpass, we will continue to look at this. We will continue to report on this. And one of the things, if we haven't heard anything else today, we have heard get involved in your local politics, know who your local school board members are, start there. Of course, keep watch on what we know can and will happen at the federal level, but starting at home. Now, people are going to ask, where can they find you? Please go to the comments and please put your information. How can people find you? Do you have a subreddit? Do you have a newsletter? Do you have a website? Go there. Guys, we are really excited to have these beautiful, bright minds with us. And we're in such a better place now because we have you guys leading the charge in so many different areas. Any last parting words or something you didn't get a chance to say that you're like, I need to say this right now? Anybody?
Get involved in your local school board. Get involved in your local school.
Run for office. Right, Francesca?
Yeah, run for office and be prepared, because let me tell you, local office it's not like a presidency where people are like, people revere you and it's hard work. So run for it. We need this. We need fresh voices. We need people who are going to do the work. I'm sorry, go ahead. What else do you guys think?
It's really difficult for people to yell when they don't know the base of the base of the issue. Again, you can't get mad that you abolish the public Department of Education, blah, 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 when you don't know the name of your local school. So get involved in your local school district. Get involved. Run for office of your local school board. Get into the mess if you want to fix it. No matter which side of this political discussion you're on, up, down, left, or right, you have to get involved.
Love it.
Yeah, and do what you can. Do what you can. Decide. You know what that is. You know where you're gonna best serve our country, and you do that, right? Like, I do a lot of stuff, but the way that I was best able to be of support to what I thought to my goals of protecting freedom in this country was through social media and social media advocacy. So, and that's what I did. I used the platforms that I had built and I repurposed them and I aimed them at doing all that I could do to. Was I muted the whole time?
No, just
somehow muted. And so that's what, again, I would recommend. Do what you can do and do it well.
I would say, I think that sometimes people let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And they have this vision of a time when, like, we had a president we liked and we had Congress that was not crazy. And that's true, but that was like a small moment in the grand history of our country, right? We have had to make progress under unfavorable conditions since day one, right? So I think, again, one of the reasons why it's so important to teach history is to give perspective And so that folks can see the current moment in the context of where we've been and hopefully where we're going. Octavia Butler, who is a Black science fiction writer, said Black people have always had to be in the future, right? Like we've always had to reach forward. And other people from other cultures for whom this society wasn't built for, even though they built it, right? So I think that keeping that perspective and thinking about like what is possible, using the tools that we do have. The law is still the law until it's not, right? And so understanding what the guardrails are, what the rights are, what the requirements are, and using those to your benefit, but not waiting to move until, your team is in office, right? Like there's still work that needs to be done. We do work on behalf of children, right, who can't yet vote in many cases, unless you're working with, older high school students, and who are depending on us to move regardless of circumstances. And so I would just like encourage all of us to keep that perspective, push for the vision that you want, be in the future, but also be very grounded in the present, in your community, in your neighborhood, in yourself, and realize that there's like more available here than you might think is possible. But we don't do this because it's easy. We do it because it needs to be done. So I think I'll just end there.
Thank you guys for joining us. We appreciate you guys. We know it is 8:30 on a school night. So I don't know if you guys were like me, but I got to get kids in bed. Thank you guys. Y'all follow them, reach out to them. These are some of our brightest minds in education. Have a good one.